When people think of ancient Rome, they imagine marble temples, majestic statues, and disciplined legions marching beneath imperial banners. The empire is remembered as the birthplace of law, architecture, and civilization itself. Yet beneath this grand image lay a darker reality, one that historians rarely discuss. Rome did not only rule through military strength or political strategy, it ruled through fear, and one of its most disturbing tools of control was public humiliation and sexualized execution. In the mid-1st century CE, during the reign of Emperor Nero, a young woman was dragged through the streets of Rome, naked and chained. Her name has been lost to history, but her suffering became a spectacle for thousands. Her so-called crime may have been adultery, defying a senator's command, or insulting imperial authority. The details were irrelevant. What mattered to Rome was the message her death would send. No one defies the empire and keeps their dignity. This ritual was known as damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. It was a punishment reserved for slaves, criminals, and women accused of serious moral or political offenses. But before the condemned ever reached the arena, they endured something even worse, a parade of shame. Roman streets were packed for these events. Citizens gathered from dawn, eager to witness what they called justice, but what modern eyes would recognize as psychological torture. The condemned woman would be stripped of her clothing and paraded through the city, her body smeared with filth and blood. Spectators threw garbage, stones, and insults. Ancient poet Martial and historian Cassius Dio both mention that these parades followed deliberate routes, past temples, markets, and family homes. Every stop was chosen to intensify the humiliation. To the Romans, this was not random cruelty. It was theater, a moral performance meant to reinforce loyalty to the state. The empire understood that destroying a person's dignity in public was more powerful than merely ending their life. Every citizen watching learned a silent lesson. The empire controls not just your body, but your honor, your reputation, even your memory. The women subjected to this fate were often treated as symbolic enemies of Roman virtue. Some were accused of violating chastity, others of political disobedience. In many cases, the accusations were exaggerated or fabricated to make examples of them. The psychological impact was devastating. To be stripped naked in front of one's community, one's family, and even one's children was to lose every social bond that made a person human. Quick reminder, if you are enjoying, do like the video and subscribe the channel for more historical torture content. Contemporary Roman families were expected to attend these events. Parents brought their children to watch, claiming it was an education in discipline and morality. Some even encouraged participation, shouting insults, throwing stones, or mocking the condemned. To refuse to take part could itself be seen as sympathy for the criminal, a dangerous stance in a society ruled by suspicion and fear. Roman guards who handled these parades were not untrained soldiers. They were specialists in humiliation, trained to extend the torment and manipulate the crowd. They paused the march at symbolic places, forced the condemned to stand upright when she tried to fall, and ensured every attempt at modesty or resistance was punished. The goal was not just to punish the individual, but to erase her social identity completely. To the Roman authorities, this process served both legal and psychological purposes. Public punishment was a warning to others, but it also reaffirmed the divine order, the idea that Rome's power was absolute, sanctioned by the gods. By humiliating women in particular, the empire reinforced patriarchal dominance and social hierarchy. Every spectacle reminded citizens who held control, the emperor, the senate, and the gods that supposedly blessed them. Historical sources suggest that such spectacles could draw tens of thousands of spectators. Inscriptions and graffiti found near the Colosseum and other arenas show how normalized this brutality became. Romans wrote slogans celebrating the deaths of prisoners and even depicted them in mosaics within private homes. Violence had become entertainment, and humiliation was its most popular act. What makes this history particularly disturbing is the level of organization behind it. Rome's judicial system and entertainment industry worked together. Trials were often staged to lead to public executions that coincided with festivals or imperial anniversaries. A condemned woman's march might take place the day before her death in the arena, a grim form of advertising for the next day's spectacle. For the victim, the journey through the streets was only the first chapter of her suffering. The next stage took place in the amphitheater, before roaring crowds of tens of thousands. There, under the hot Mediterranean sun, she would face death in forms so horrific that even later Roman writers hesitated to describe them fully. Yet before we reach that part of the story, it's important to understand why Rome embraced such extreme cruelty in the first place. Roman society valued strength, control, and dominance. These values extended beyond the battlefield into every corner of life: politics, family, religion, and entertainment. Mercy was seen not as virtue, but as weakness. To survive, a Roman had to prove superiority over others, especially over women and slaves. Public humiliation became a reflection of Rome's belief in order through domination. This attitude was deeply ingrained in Roman religion. The gods themselves were depicted as punishing, lustful, and vengeful. Myths told of divine beings who humiliated mortals for disobedience, turning them into animals, statues, or slaves. These stories justified real-world cruelty. Executions and punishments became religious theater, reenacting myths to demonstrate divine justice. For historians, reconstructing these events is difficult. Much of the evidence comes from scattered writings, poems, satires, or letters that survive only in fragments. Many later historians deliberately avoided describing these spectacles in detail. Christian chroniclers writing centuries later often downplayed them, while Roman historians of the imperial era sometimes glorified them as symbols of discipline. But archaeological discoveries and cross-referenced ancient sources now reveal a consistent pattern. Sexualized public punishment was not an exception, but a system. By the end of the 1st century CE, the practice had become institutionalized. Officials known as curatores ludorum, curators of games, oversaw the logistics of such executions. Imperial edicts outlined when and how condemned criminals could be displayed. Some amphitheaters even had underground chambers specifically designed to hold prisoners before their processions began. Rome had industrialized humiliation. The tragedy of that nameless woman in 64 CE represents countless others whose stories were never recorded. Each was used as a tool to enforce obedience and moral conformity. Each became a public lesson in fear. And for centuries, these rituals were accepted as normal, even celebrated. By the time the condemned woman reached the arena, her humiliation was already complete. But in ancient Rome, humiliation was only the prelude to what the empire considered justice. The arena was where punishment transformed into performance, where the line between law, religion, and entertainment disappeared entirely. The Roman Colosseum, completed in 80 CE, could hold over 50,000 spectators. It was not only an architectural marvel, it was a psychological weapon. From emperors to ordinary citizens, the entire population participated in the ritualized destruction of human beings. What began as military celebration evolved into an elaborate theater of pain, and at the center of it all was the condemned woman, stripped not only of clothing but of identity. To the Roman mind, the arena was sacred ground. It symbolized divine justice and imperial power. Every execution was framed as a moral lesson, often dressed in mythological disguise. The victims were forced to reenact stories from Roman mythology, particularly those involving the punishment of disobedient women. Ancient writers like Cassius Dio, Martial, and Suetonius recorded disturbing accounts of these performances. A woman condemned for adultery might be forced to play the role of Europa, who was carried off by Zeus disguised as a bull. But in the arena, there was no symbolism. Trained animals, bulls, boars, or even bears, were used to assault or kill the victim while the crowd cheered. These reenactments turned mythology into state-sanctioned pornography, blurring the boundary between religion and spectacle. The Romans called these acts supplicia, meaning punishments. But supplicia was more than death. It was the systematic destruction of humanity. Victims were displayed alive, sometimes for hours, subjected to degradation before being killed. They were forced to crawl, to beg, to plead in front of the roaring audience. Their suffering became the script of the empire's moral theater. To the spectators, This was not barbarism, it was education. Parents brought their children believing that witnessing death would build discipline and respect for authority. The crowd's reactions shaped the pace of the spectacle. Thumbs raised or lowered determined whether the victim would die quickly or endure more torment. Every gesture became part of the performance. The emperor, seated in his gilded box, presided like a god deciding fates. Historical evidence suggests that some emperors, such as Nero and Caligula, personally took part in designing these executions. They saw themselves as artists of punishment. Caligula, according to Suetonius, once staged entire performances centered on the deaths of women accused of immorality. He ordered architects, animal trainers, and torturers to invent new ways to display the human body in pain. Inscriptions found near the Colosseum reveal the organization behind these events. There were officials responsible for costumes, stage props, and the release of animals at precise moments. The condemned were dressed as mythological figures, Danae Pacificae Leda, women from myths who had suffered divine violation. In Rome, their stories became literal reenactments of sexualized violence. The state used mythology to justify the degradation of real women. The victims' final moments were often prolonged for hours. Animals were trained not to kill instantly, but to terrorize and maim. Executioners were instructed to intervene when the animal grew tired, ensuring that the victim remained alive for the audience's pleasure. When the crowd grew restless, a signal from the emperor would end the spectacle, usually through dismemberment or impalement. The noise of 50,000 people cheering during such scenes was described by witnesses as deafening. Roman poets compared it to thunder. The arena became a microcosm of the empire, an image of control, hierarchy, and obedience. At the center, the condemned symbolized disorder, and her destruction symbolized the restoration of order. But beyond the spectacle, there was an underlying message. The Romans used these executions to maintain social discipline. Women who challenged authority, who spoke too freely, or who simply became inconvenient to powerful men, could be condemned under moral laws. The arena made an example of them, transforming personal vengeance into public justice. One of the most haunting cases recorded by Roman historians involved Empress Messalina, wife of Emperor Claudius. Accused of adultery and conspiracy, she was subjected to public degradation before her execution. Ancient accounts describe how she was stripped before senators and forced to crawl across the arena floor. Although some of these details were likely exaggerated by her enemies, they reflect Rome's cultural obsession with the public shaming of women in power. The brutality extended beyond Rome itself. Throughout the empire, local amphitheaters replicated these spectacles. From North Africa to Britannia, provincial governors organized their own executions following the same patterns. The empire exported humiliation as a method of governance, ensuring that the fear of public disgrace held even distant provinces in obedience. To modern readers, these acts may seem unthinkable, but to Romans, they were normalized. Philosophers and poets attended these events without moral hesitation. Even Seneca, who later criticized the excesses of arena games, once described them as a necessary expression of Roman virtue. The blending of entertainment, punishment, and moral instruction made cruelty acceptable. Archaeological discoveries support these written accounts. Frescoes, mosaics, and carvings depicting executions have been found in Roman homes and villas. One mosaic from a villa near Pompeii shows a woman bound to a wooden frame as wild beasts approach, a chilling reminder that Romans not only tolerated these scenes, but celebrated them in private art. What makes this history so disturbing is not only the violence itself, but the cultural structure that supported it. The Roman arena was not chaos, it was order. Every act of cruelty had ritual meaning. The condemned were not killed for pleasure alone, but to affirm the moral and political dominance of the empire. To challenge Rome was to risk not only death, but erasure, body, name, and honor destroyed before the eyes of the world. By the 3rd century CE, as the empire expanded, the spectacles became even more elaborate. Entire days were dedicated to executions between gladiatorial combats and animal hunts. The line between punishment and theater vanished completely. What had begun as ritualized justice had evolved into a machinery of spectacle fed by human suffering. And yet, beneath the cheering crowds and imperial ceremony, something began to change. Whispers of discomfort appeared among philosophers and early Christians. A few questioned whether these events reflected Roman greatness or moral decay. The first cracks appeared in the moral foundation of the empire, but before Rome abandoned its cruelest traditions, it would commit one of the most horrifying acts of all, the punishment reserved for its most sacred women, the Vestal Virgins. They were the keepers of the eternal flame, symbols of purity and divine favor. And when one was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, Rome faced a terrible dilemma: how to destroy what it most revered without defying its own gods. The answer became one of the most chilling rituals in Roman history, a punishment so cruel that even Rome's citizens called it the Silent Death. The story of Emperor Caracalla and his copper cauldrons does not end with the steam fading or the fires dying out. In fact, it opens a window into a civilization that stood proudly at the crossroads of progress and barbarity. Rome, a world that could engineer aqueducts and also invent boiling death. Historians have long debated whether Caracalla's acts of torture were the result of personal madness or a reflection of Roman justice itself. Ancient sources, like Cassius Dio, described him as ruthless, suspicious, and obsessed with authority. To Caracalla, fear was not a byproduct of rule, it was the foundation of it. The molten cauldron, then, was more than an instrument of death. It was a message to the empire: obedience at all costs. The spectacle of punishment had meaning in Rome. Executions were not conducted in private chambers, but in public arenas where thousands watched. Fire, steel, and pain became instruments of political theater. A condemned man's suffering reinforced the illusion of divine order. Caesar's justice served under the eyes of the gods. For Caracalla, who ruled between 198 and 217 CE, cruelty was not senseless. It was structured, ritualized, and purposeful. When the emperor ordered prisoners boiled alive in the bronze cauldrons, he wasn't simply ending their lives. He was reminding Rome of his divine right to control life and death, but the same heat that burned his enemies also consumed his legacy. In 217 CE, Caracalla met the very fate he had inflicted upon others: sudden, violent, and humiliating. Stabbed to death by one of his own soldiers on the road to Carrhae, he died without ceremony. His empire left trembling. The people who once feared him now spat his name in disgust. After his death, the copper cauldrons were reportedly dismantled, melted, and repurposed. Some say for temple offerings, others for weapons. Yet the image of those massive pots, bubbling with molten punishment, endured in legend and record alike. They came to symbolize the boiling heart of tyranny, where power thrived on suffering. Today, the remains of Caracalla's baths, enormous marble halls and scorched furnace pits, still stand in Rome. Tourists walk through the same corridors where water once flowed to soothe citizens, not torture them. The irony is haunting. The emperor who made water into a weapon left behind one of the greatest architectural tributes to leisure and peace. The copper cauldron became a forgotten relic, but its lesson endures. Rome's brilliance was inseparable from its brutality. The same civilization that shaped law, art, and architecture also mastered the art of pain. And as the flames of Caracalla's cauldrons flicker through history, they remind us that progress and cruelty have always walked side by side, one illuminating, the other burning.